So, just over the last 24 or so hours, the U.S. tried to impose its will with its Project Freedom by having ships start crossing the Strait of Hormuz. It also fired upon, apparently, a few what it described as IRGC swift boats. Iran says they were fishing boats. And Iran's response was interesting, to say the least. I'm Borzu Deragahi. I am the founder of the podcast and Substack newsletter Badlands. You can find it at Borzu, BORZOU.substack.com. I'm also on Apple podcasts and Spotify and YouTube. So I think that how Iran responded was just extraordinary in a way, and I don't think a lot of media caught on to the significance of the Iranian response. Iran responded basically by launching a dozen or so ballistic missiles and a bunch of drones at the United Arab Emirates. And this was like basically an incredibly harsh escalation. Now, the UAE, with the help apparently of Israel, managed to block many of those missiles. But this was a really harsh response to what was a rather minor, relatively, provocation by the United States in trying to test Iran's resolve with regard to the Strait of Hormuz. They basically could have really done some serious damage with 12 ballistic missiles and a bunch of swarms of drones. And they basically sent them, this is the message, is that if you try anything, United States, we're not afraid of escalation. That's the Iranian message, that they're totally willing to launch a hellish war and go back to the same level of intensity as during the 40-day war, let's call it that, that devastated parts of Iran as well as the Gulf and also drew Israel and Lebanon in. So I think that is a very significant response. It shows that real hardliners are in charge in Tehran. And it shows also that Iran is really, as it has been saying publicly, not afraid of escalation. Meanwhile, you have a situation where Donald Trump, the president of the U.S., he's like a week or 9 days away from visiting Beijing in this big, huge, historic summit with the premier, the head of China, Xi Jinping. And the last thing he wants is like a war to be raging during that time. But the second last thing that he wants is for this crisis to be continuing and the war to continue to be dragging down the U.S. economy. I spoke just recently, today actually, with India's Newsx World about the latest in Iran and a few other developments in the theater of the war. Take a listen.
Borzo Daragahi, Iranian-American journalist and founder of the Badlands newsletter, joining us live. To what extent do you believe then that Trump is accurate in saying that Iran has no supreme leader, even if it's the IRGC, even if it's a proxy like Hezbollah? To what extent do you believe then that, yes, the U.S. is essentially the unipolar power and will go the distance and walk away from this with a victory? What are your thoughts?
It's incorrect to say that Iran has no leader right now. I think it shows a fundamental misunderstanding of the Iranian system and how it works and the structure that's in place. The Supreme National Security Council is the ultimate arbiter of big decisions in Iran. That includes the supreme leader, who is apparently injured and perhaps partially incapacitated. It includes the president, the heads of the IRGC, and so on. And this system has been in place for decades. So, yeah, there's this sort of consensus system run by a group of elite people in the regime. And so I think that's inaccurate. As for the U.S. making whatever decision it wants, the U.S. does have a lot of power, but that unipolar moment in history when America was this sort of overwhelming force has faded. In addition to that, and it's a tragedy, I have to say, as an American, that we as Americans have not learned this, military force in that sense no longer works. The world is way too nuanced. Cities and urban areas are way more crowded. Public opinion matters. You can't go around bombing people and saying, "Oh, we targeted an official," and killed him, and you killed 100 other people in that same apartment block, and you can't get away with that kind of stuff anymore, like the way that Israel does warfare or the way that the United States does warfare. So I think that the world has changed and the US doesn't get that. I thought we were getting it, but apparently we haven't.
Essentially, what you just described seems like to me that when you discuss the nuance of the world we live in, of course, there are so many nuances. There's a tech nuance, which leads me to think of cybercrime, right? And one of the first few questions I discuss with guests and analysts and experts on this show, when I first essentially started covering the US-Israel-Iran war that essentially broke out on February 28th with surprise attacks, was why didn't the US and Israel, if they essentially wanted to infiltrate Iran and control their regime, try to do that through a cyber route, for example, or a financial route? Because in the months that essentially came after those attacks, what happened is that we saw banks pull out of the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Of course, we saw infrastructure being blown up right in front of our faces, and airports and essentially airspaces being shut down as well. Mr. Daragahi, can you speak to me about the essential acceleration of cybercrime, if you could, and essentially why or why not this may not have been the path of war or attrition that the US and Israel wanted to take or could have taken? What are your thoughts, sir?
I'm sure they tried. I'm sure they looked at the cyber route, disruption of internet and so on. I'm sure that they've done that in the past against Iran, and I know that they've done it against Iran and infiltrated it. And I know that Iran, perhaps with the help of China and perhaps with the assistance of Russia, has learned to evade those techniques. As for financial pressure on Iran, I mean, they've tried that too. I don't think anything gets any more harsh than the maximum pressure campaign that Donald Trump launched against Iran during his first term, and that somewhat continued even during the Biden years. And you know, there has been reports of America seizing Iranian crypto accounts and sanctioning this official, doing this, doing that, etc. But I think that the problem for the U.S. is they're using these tools that are kind of easily at their disposal. Let me paint a scenario for you, and this will depict the American dilemma right now. Let's say the U.S. succeeds and overthrows the regime in Tehran, and they manage to create a sort of civil war-like condition that is very likely, where the remnants of the former regime are, fighting against the regime that the United States installs. Even then, they might not get what they want. They definitely won't reopen the Strait of Hormuz if there's a massive insurgency raging across the country with rockets and drones hitting ships and so on. And they may not even be able to access, in that chaos that is the fantasy of Israel and perhaps some planners in the US, they may not even be able to access that nuclear material. The goals they have are only attainable via diplomacy right now, and that seems to be something that is toxic to certain elements in the US administration.
Thank you so much for listening. I'm Borzou Daragahi. This is my podcast. It's called Badlands. It's at Borzou, Borzou.substack.com. You can also find me at YouTube and Spotify and on Apple Podcasts.